It's been kind of fun to talk about Rings of Power and all of the spin that a lot of these outlets have been trying to put on it, like Screen Rant, Forbes, Washington Post, Rolling Stone. All of these outlets have been trying to spin this show as a success, as a hit, and it's not. It's very, very disliked by its audience. A lot of people just not giving this good reviews. It's not in a good place. In fact, there's a much superior show in House of the Dragon that's also a fantasy show. It's a lot of fun to watch this show. I like watching all of the political games they play, like the former Hand of the King trying to politically maneuver his grandchild onto the Iron Throne. There's been some fun watching that stuff. It reminds me of when Game of Thrones was good. Those early seasons of Game of Thrones were amazing. And then season 7 and 8 happened, and the show went off the rails and just died a horrible death. I really didn't think this show was going to be able to recover from the disaster that was season 8, but it did, and it has been a great show so far. Looking at these tomato scores and how they're close is an insult. There is no way in hell Rings of Power is anywhere near as good as House of the Dragon. House of the Dragon is a great show, but it's funny to watch them dance these scores here to try to justify this. It took 292 ratings to get this to 84, whereas this one, it took 619 to get it up to 85. That's a joke. But a bigger joke has been watching the media try to simp for this show and then finally kind of write positive, negative articles. Like yesterday, I went over that article that talked about how Galadriel's an awful character. She is an awful character. And they finally admitted it. Now, Forbes, one of the biggest damage control agents for Rings of Power, is also admitting that House of the Dragon is a superior show. Much better show. And I agree. But Forbes has wrote a lot of negative articles about fans. They've wrote a lot of they've wrote a lot of articles about how great that show is. And it's always, this is why they have to focus on saying that fans are racist and sexist, because they can't actually sit down and defend how bad the show is. They have to focus on that because that takes their writing points off of the fact that the show is awful. But in this one, they actually admit everything, which is funny. I want you to listen to some of this. HBO's House of the Dragon and Amazon's Rings of Power are two very different shows. The only resemblance, really, is the fantasy setting. That's true. They are completely different. One is good, for example, and one is bad. Still, it's fun to compare them. I agree. It's fun to compare how House of the Dragon had similar controversies leading up to it as Rings of Power did. But all of a sudden, a show comes out and it's good, House of the Dragon, and people accept it and love it, versus Rings of Power, which is awful. Rings of Power is visually striking, and some of the side plots are actually pretty intriguing. It's not the flaming disaster some Tolkien fans were expecting. Yes, it is. It's a huge disaster. But listen to this. But when it comes to the writing and character development, House of the Dragon reigns supreme. It's flying in circles around rings, shooting flames at its high-budget competitor. I agree. The biggest and most notable thing to me is that this show cost less to make this show than it did House of the Dragon. And it looks higher production than Rings of Power. House of the Dragon cost less to make than Rings of Power. And the sets look better. Everything looks better. The costumes look better. Everything looks better on this show. And it was made cheaper than Rings of Power. Rings of Power looks amateur. Like the sets looked like they just rolled off of the factory floor. These look weathered and old and kind of gritty. It's very noticeable. Take screenshots of some of the sets if you can find. Like, there's similar sets of them on the boat. Like in episode 4, there's scenes of her on a boat. Take that and compare it to the Elven boat scene. And just take screenshots of both scenes and compare it. Tell me which one looks better and more realistic. And I know saying realistic and fantasy, but I mean, come on. You know what I'm saying. The difference is highlighted by the opening scene of episode 4 of House of the Dragon, which shows Princess Rhaenyra enduring the process of choosing a suitor, mocking the little boys and crusty fossils that show up to claim her hand. It's a very simple scene, but one that shows the strength of the writing, as we get a good sense of the personality of every character who appears on screen, even if they only appear for a moment. That's true. Superior. It's what a good writer can do. And then, in contrast, Rings of Power has struggled to communicate who its main players really are. So far, most feel like hollow archetypes, wandering around a beautiful, empty world. Much of the dialogue reheats tired fantasy tropes, stern leaders speaking of broken alliances, rising darkness, and ancient prophecies. And then they go on to admit how House of the Dragon is a story about people trapped in systems and trying to break out of their cages, but keeping them free from rivals, whereas Rings of Power is just a evil rising, we got to stop it, boring trope. Well, I take that back. That can be a great premise for a great show if you have interesting shit going on. And not Galadriel, who is awful and cannot lead a show because she is boring and hollow and not intriguing at all. But it's really funny to hear them admit this. And this isn't the only article that exists on Rings of Power and how bad it is. In fact, if I look through most of these positive articles and read through it, most of them probably have a lot of critiques of the Rings of Power, but they kind of juggle it around and word it in a positive fashion. We learned when Captain Marvel came out, because Captain Marvel's a freaking awful movie. We learned when that movie came out, there were leaks. I remember this leak of this journalist talking about how you have to pick your battles. You have to track this down, but I do remember this being talked about, and I do remember hearing that clip, reading something about it. So I guess take it with a grain of salt, because I can't pull it up, but there was talk about how these critics have to pick their battles, and sometimes they just have to, like in a moment like that, because that was like a high-powered feminism movie, you know, big feminism hero, Captain Marvel. They all kind of just went with and got with the program and gave it good reviews to just, you know, fight the chuds and please Disney in a way. So that way they can be hard on something else and still get access. That's what they're doing with Rings of Power, basically, is they're going hard to defend it. This is they're picking the battle so they can please Amazon and still get access. This way, when a different expensive type of Amazon show comes out, they'll still get access to it. And that one, they'll be allowed to be honest on. But Rings of Power, they absolutely have to give that good ratings, even though it's shit. Anyway, let me know what you guys think about this. What do you think about some of them actually admitting House of the Dragon is better of the two? What are your thoughts? I'd like to hear from you. Also, if you would please like, subscribe, share the video. Make sure you're still subscribed. Hit that notification bell. And I'll see you on the next one. Peace. Make sure to check out my locals. There's a link in the description. It's a fun community that I'm trying to build over here. If you don't want to support me on YouTube, you can come over here. None of that money goes to YouTube. You also can just come over here for free. But if you are a supporter over here, I do plan on doing an extra live stream once a month and throwing links to the supporters so you can actually come on and have a supporter live stream with me. Also, it's a good place to catch all of my content. You don't have to worry about notifications like YouTube. They'll definitely work over here. So come check out my locals.